I see you got coffee here, so you must be into coffee too.
Yeah, and I have to push back on Josiah's take. Black coffee is the best coffee, and I think that the reason that he thinks it's an old person thing is because young people are cowards.
Oh, whoa. That shot's fired right there, man. It's just going to be like a series. All my interviews are just going to be the next person hating on the last person's idea. So whoever I have next on the show is definitely going to be into not black coffee.
I drink some coffee before noon, and then it's all tea all the way for me.
So the topic that we're going to be discussing, and I don't know, would you consider yourself an expert in this topic?
No, I would consider myself an expert in.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not yet a senior scholar in the field. But
okay,
so there's different levels of expertise, sure, but I would consider myself to have expertise in this.
Welcome to the Chattervast podcast, and today I have my friend, and I'm probably gonna say your name wrong at some point because I don't have a lot of Davids in my life. Now, was that something you chose, like to be called David, or is that how your parents said it?
Well, my name was David, like when I was a wee little tiny baby. But my family's Cajun. So we're
okay.
heritage, and so my mom would speak French with her dad, and they would talk to me, obviously, her newborn baby. And when they talked about me in French, they would say David instead of David because it's awkward to say a whole sentence in French and just have one English word in the middle. So, so she's
that makes sense.
Just when she was talking to her dad, and so my older brother picked up on that and started calling me that. And I mean, I've been David since I was like 6 months old, so. My birth certificate does technically say David. You can't prove otherwise.
Well, either way, Cajun, French Canadians represent. So there we go. That's where my family comes from, Southern Quebec. So I know all of you long lost brethren got dragged off by the British down there. So in spirit, we're together.
Right. Yeah.
So today's topic is music theory. And I know, like, I've told several people, and I know you probably, like, much to your chagrin, when I tell people we're talking about music theory, their eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, that's great for you. And I was like, well, you probably just don't, I think, from most people's perspectives, you just don't understand enough about what it is or the reasoning behind it to appreciate it, even though it practically impacts your life every day, probably, because I mean almost everybody listens to or plays music at some point or another. And I'm here to have you explain and give us some thoughts as to what it is and why it is, and some of the good reasonings why we should care or how it actually impacts us. So going to first, David, is why are you an expert in this, and where are you at as far as in your degree and research in it?
Well, so I'm in my second year of coursework. I'm a PhD music theory student here at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. I've got undergrad and master's degrees in music theory and piano performance as well. So, I mean, if we're talking about why would I consider myself an expert, well, I do have the credentials of one, but that's not always enough because there are people who can get credentials without necessarily proving that. I actually don't really understand this question. Why do I consider myself an expert?
It's difficult, I think, of a question, because if anybody ever considers themselves an expert in something, I think most people's thought is, oh, they're just trying to sell me something, right? I mean, you take a little bit of a back if it comes across as sometimes like prideful or haughty, but I'm not asking in that light. I'm more compared to where everybody else is among the common populace. Your knowledge in this area is too much more, like you said, like you're getting degrees in this and you have much more an advanced knowledge, and thus you would be classified as an expert to me and most of my friends because you can actually explain what it is and why it matters. I think that's what really communicates what being an expert in something is, like using something or being able to explain it to somebody else, like a teacher, I guess. So
well, thanks for answering the question for me.
Just here to make you look good.
Well, speaking of teaching, that's actually a big part of what I do is teach. I wouldn't claim myself to be unique in any viewpoint that I express today. They aren't all universal viewpoints. There are disagreements and arguments about probably all of them, but every point I'll make today is a point that plenty of other people make.
Okay, well, that's good. And I think we talked about this the other day when I was looking into music theory. I was like, well, I feel like a lot of the other conversations that I've had on my podcast have been a little more volatile. I mean, when we covered the Enneagram and occult connections or fundamental Christians voting for Biden. Like, that's pretty volatile. But then when I came to music theory, I was like, I don't even know what terms to search to find out if this is like a hot topic in any way. It's like, well, isn't it more like fact or something? I just drew blanks, which I'm sure you're used to. People, they're like, what do you mean when you say the word music theory? Like the theory of music? So I'm guessing, like, what do you, this would probably answer more of my questions and my listeners' questions. Like, what is music theory? If you could like break it down to somebody, a plebeian view or mindset on it.
Yeah, music theory is just trying to figure out how music works.
Hmm.
And I know that sounds really vague, but that's on purpose, because whatever comes to mind for you when you think of, how music works, somebody's doing that. That's either a subfield within music theory, it's some interdisciplinary field that intersects between music theory and something else. It's someone adjacent to music theory is doing something like that. It's vague for a reason, because people trying to figure out how music works, you might ask questions like, well, what music? Yes. Or what do you mean? Harmony, rhythm, melody, anything like that? Yes. We're working on that.
So when you say working on that, I
I
guess
guess
this
this rolls into kind of something we talked about the other
day,
day, as far as addressing another question. Maybe I'm going too quickly with this.
And if you have
anything in between here that you want to say before we like jump into the next part of it, but like how this affects somebody like in your role or somebody who's researching music.
From my perspective, and probably some from my friends' perspectives, if you're researching music theory, we probably don't assume that that is directly affecting common music that people listen to every day now. Like, are there things that you feel like people in music theory are researching that affect us now, and change what we're listening to that's current and popular, or whatever people are listening to on their day-to-day? Or is it more of like this is affecting stuff to come out in the future?
No, so music theory is a retrospective act for the most part. Well, it's not quite cut and dry, but for the most part, music theorists look at music that already exists and try to explain our intuitions about that music and challenge us to hear it in richer ways. It's not, for the most part, a compositional procedure. There was a school of composer theorists that sort of were instrumental in the founding of it as a discipline in North America in the 60s and 70s. That's people like Milton Babbitt and George Pearl, and they were composers who would compose using the analytical tools they were developing. But that is not really something that most people do. Dmitry Tomashko is probably the most notable exception right now. He works with like geometrical arrays of pitch classes and set classes, and he composes with them. So, but anyway, for the most part, theorists are interested in music that already exists. Common misconception, sometimes people ask me, oh, so you write music? And no, I don't. I write about music that already exists.
So more like what literary analysis?
Yes, it's much more like someone writing about literature than someone who's an author. I can probably clarify it by making a few generalizations about the field. One thing that music theory that I hinted at is concerned with is explaining our intuitions. So we come to music as Western listeners. We come to Western music specifically. We'll stick with just Western music for now, since that's both you and I's repertoire that we know. We come to Western music with a certain set of learned intuitions about it. So, for example, what comes next?
I don't know if I made that note right.
You got to it. There's a really funny video actually on the internet. It's like 6 seconds, and it's a guy going, and then he goes over to his cat, and his cat goes meow. My point is, that's an expectation that we have just naturally as listeners, right? Our expectation is this note is going to go to this note. So one thing that music theories do, one of the goals of music theory is to explain why that is our intuition for this repertoire. So music theory conclusions, I should say, are repertoire specific. If we say this is something that is normally expected, we don't mean in all music. We mean specific subset of music. So in this case, I'm talking about Western classical tonal music. We have this expectation. But in jazz, that note doesn't have to go anywhere. Right?
It's interesting when you come to jazz, as far as my opinion is, it doesn't have as many constraints as other music types. Like you were just pointing out, we have a progression in our mind. So music theory is just looking at that and saying, hey, here are some like rules that we've seen people do with this types of music, and then thus going forward, like we could know those things and make more of this related to that.
Sort of. So you mentioned make more of them. That's, again, music theory. The goal of music theory is not to prescribe compositional precepts. It's not to say, here's how music works. Now go forth and use these rules to write good music as opposed to bad music. Music theory is not a quality judgment. Music that follows these rules is good, and music that doesn't follow these rules is bad because the theory teacher told you to. That's a common misconception. Music theoretical conclusions are not value judgments, and they are not compositional precepts. They're a set of observations about a particular repertoire that helps you to hear that repertoire more richly. We'll take our expectation, our leading tone. This is a leading tone, by the way, because it leads to this note. So we call it a leading tone. That's a theoretical construct. That's theorists looking at a lot of music from this time period. This is tonal music from like 1700-ish to like 1850-ish, 1600 if you want to be generous. And we're like, this is what usually happens in that music. It's an expectation we have. And by naming our expectations, by giving us an explicit theoretical construct to the expectation, we can then refine it. So intuitively, we all come to music knowing this note goes to this note, but we don't necessarily know why. So music will explain, oh, well, it's because this chord goes to this chord, because this bass motion establishes this chord as central. So we kind of like flesh out what our expectations are, and in doing so, we can refine them. So we can hear, for example, when that chord doesn't go to that note, when it goes somewhere else, we can explain why that strikes us in some way as unexpected. It affects how we hear that progression in light of our expectations, which are refined by an explicit theoretical model.
How is this related to mathematics? And then also, is there some relation to
human emotions? Like, oh, because it went up and then down, we perceive that as sad. Like, does music theory discuss mathematics or emotion related things in light of that?
Remember at the beginning where I said that music theory is about figuring out how music works? Asked about two ways that music works, mathematically and affectively with emotions. And those are both entire sub-disciplines within music theory.
Wow, complete sub-disciplines. That's pretty crazy.
A whole subfield of people applying mathematical models to music and like using group theory and stuff like that to model tonal behaviors. And it's not a field I am in any way qualified to talk about. That talk to my friend Noah about that if you want. He knows all about that, but I don't. And then affect. Well, affect is arguably the first thing people were trying to figure out with music. Writings on affect goes all the way back to antiquity. You got writing about how certain modes sound and make the people stronger or make the people weaker. And these modes are good to use in society, and these modes are bad to use in society. I mean, people writing about affect in music goes all the way back that far, and people still write about it. So, music theory is saying, given this body of music, knowing these things about it will enrich your experience of the music. It's about challenging you to listen to music in a new way and to engage with it more deeply.
I think I had brought this up yesterday when we were talking about modes, and I know everybody has different opinions, throwing out names discreetly, Nathan. And so I brought up modes to like some people, him in particular, and other people. One in particular, I had heard about the Locrian mode. And when you listen to Locrian mode, most people, I had played a couple songs for them, and they'd be like, that sounds bad. Like, it just doesn't sound good. I don't know what relation music theory has to modes. I don't know how that relation works. Does it say things like that about, hey, here are modes and they make you feel ways? Or obviously music theory does not say music is good or bad, like you said before, but it can recognize, oh, people won't like this. Does it recognize any things like that?
I will say there are theorists who use theory to make qualitative judgments. I just don't. I don't think that's the most useful way to practice theory, so I don't do that. That it's, I don't think it's very productive. Anyway, but okay, yeah. So music theory and modes, right? So modes are a theoretical construct. The mode you're talking about, low Korean mode, has this interval in it, which is why you're like, it sounds bad. Your intuition is telling you that that isn't a perfect fifth, and we're used to hearing scales that have perfect fifths. And when it doesn't, it sounds weird to us.
And it also doesn't finish. You're just left there without a resolution.
Why it sounds unresolved, it's because this scale fits into this chord, which resolves here. Leading tone we were talking about? Yeah, if you play that scale, it fits into the chord that brings it up there. So that's why it's resolved to us.
What's the most productive way to use music theory?
Challenging us to hear things more richly, more deeply. I use challenge very deliberately in this sense because I think one of the more valuable things theory can do for us is say, okay, I get that you hear it this way, and I respect that, and I think that's totally valid. Here's a different way to hear it that you might not have first come to, like intuitively, but here's how I'm supporting that hearing of it through looking at all of these other songs and all of these other pieces of music that do the same thing or a similar thing. And I'm going to challenge you to try and hear it this way now and deepen your experience of the music.
So that's partly going outside of your sphere of what you're okay with or you're used to hearing and listening to something new, or even taking what you're already listening to and just looking at it in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that second one is even more productive because it's a repertoire that you love and you're familiar with already. And then, you know, a theorist writes an article that's like, hey, here's another way to hear that you wouldn't have thought of, but that's really interesting and that enriches your experience of this music that you already know and love.
I feel like it's more elusive to me how to challenge somebody to look at something they're familiar with in a different way musically.
Right. I think it's actually sort of the point of analysis in general, whether you're analyzing a movie or a work of literature or whatever. One of the big purposes of analysis is to reveal hidden connections that we wouldn't have otherwise seen.
This might be kind of hard on the fly, but do you have an example to show us with something that most people would be familiar with, and then how to look at that in a different light?
I actually was just, I was listening to, I don't know if you know the artist LP. She's pretty cool. Listening to a song of hers yesterday. I give it all to you. 'Cause every time you love me, baby. Every time I love me, baby. It's built on that 4-chord loop. And it's about, the song is called Levitator, by the way. Look it up. It's on her first album.
Okay.
And it's about, the protagonist is singing about how being in love makes her feel. And it makes her levitate, sort of lose herself in the feeling of love and being swept away by it. And there's this really amazing moment, like 2/3 of the way through the song, where a new chord gets added to the chord loop. And it's right here. And so for example, that leading tone that I was talking about earlier, the one that goes like this, is in this progression. Right? In that last chord in the loop. And that's where we expect it to resolve, but it doesn't every single time. And I mean, obviously, while we're listening to the song, we expect it to go there because it does every single time. But my interpretation of this moment, and this is just totally my own interpretation, my own hearing of that moment narratively, is whenever she's there and that new chord gets added, that's also the moment that she joins in with that resolution. And then she does this long vocalese, just textless singing. And my interpretation is that's her finally embracing the feeling of being levitated by love. So before it was sort of resisting, like still trying to hold on to oneself in being in love and trying to stay grounded. And that moment when the new chord happens and when she starts singing the new chord and starts singing the new note, that's the moment when she lets go and embraces being part of that and being part of that resolution. That's one thing I was listening to yesterday, was that song.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you can pull out a little bit more from a song, like what we were saying earlier, like literature, different things like that. You can look at that from a different perspective. And I'm assuming that I've never heard this song before. I'll definitely go look it up. But I think a lot of other people have probably heard it and didn't think about it from that perspective. I'm assuming to some degree that they probably felt or knew something inside that something was going on, but to actually add words and context to it and explain it the way you did. Is that what music theory, like you're saying, can add value by challenging you to look at what you're already listening to in a different way?
That's exactly it. Like that moment, anyone who knows the song, that moment is very jammable. Like every time it happens, you're like, yeah, and that's why I find it jammable. Those are my theoretical reasons for it.
And your music theory technical word there, jammable, for the day. We'll put that in under Grammarly or definition.com.
It's legit. And that's an example of a specific song analysis, but music theory can also draw conclusions about a repertoire. There's one theorist in our field his name is Drew Nobile, and Drew Nobile talks about telos and anti-telos choruses. A telos chorus is the chorus where like the chorus is the arrival point, and this happens a lot in older rock, and it's like we get there and we're like, boom, arrival. That's the chorus. Whereas an anti-telos chorus builds it up and then takes it away. So the build up to the chorus happens and then it's taken away. Anyway, it happens quite a bit in like post 2010s pop music. And so understanding those conclusions, understanding like his idea of the telos and the anti-telos chorus will enrich your hearing of those moments in songs that he doesn't even talk about necessarily. It's like you can go out and discover these yourself. Building up to a climax is something that music has been doing since humans have been making it. So, but understanding how that works within a stylistic context can deepen our listening of a certain repertoire. If someone wrote about musicals and how artists within musicals use that technique differently from artists who are working within like pop and rock traditions, I'm very sure that people have written about that or are currently writing about that. Anyone listening who's ever taken a theory class might be a little bit surprised by some of the points that I'm making because, the reason people's eyes glaze over whenever you say anything about music theory is because they think back to like their theory classes and then they're like, oh, music theory, that's boring. Which I was one of those students.
It's just like when you say the word art history class, to me, it's like, oh, that class. I know I'm shots fired there, but
like I'll fully cop to being that performance major in undergrad core theory classes who was just super bored like didn't care at all. I got a B in my theory 3 class with someone who is now a colleague of mine. The teacher of that class, I mean, is now I'm actually a theorist and we're cool now, but it was like, I think that probably she would not have thought back to her theory 3 students that semester and said, that one's going to be a music theorist.
So speaking to those people who are like you back then, what do you have to say? Do you want to encourage them or say like, here, look at it from this perspective and make it better or easier, or, hey, you'll be a music theorist someday or something?
No, I'm not going to say, hey, you'll be a music theorist someday. Very, very few of them ever will be. Any theory teacher who teaches as if their students are going to be music theorists or with the goal of making their students future music theorists is going to be missing the point. What I would say is, and actually I would like to direct this at anyone, people usually think of music theory as a labeling activity. So we give names to things like, that's a tonic chord, that's a dominant chord, that's a subdominant chord. Oh no, I just did retrogression, which you shouldn't in a Bach chorale, but you can do it in pop music because it sounds great. Anyway, but my point is, people think of it as a labeling activity. They think of music theory as coming up with a name for a thing in music and saying, that's the name for that thing. We did it. We're theorists. But that's not really it. So thinking of music theory as knowing the right names for things is like thinking that knowing the names and functions of woodworking tools is the same thing as being a carpenter. The names for things and like labels for chords, those are the tools with which you can do theory within a certain context. They are not theory themselves. They are the tools you can use to create something, to create an interpretation, to come to new light about a repertoire. They are not the end goal. Knowing that that's a 5-chord is trivial compared to knowing different ways that different composers might use a 5-chord and how that enriches your experience of their music.
With literary analysis, like you were saying, tools, knowing that something rhyming scheme in poetry is like A, B, A, B, that's not like actual analysis from my perspective. That's just, like you said, a tool. What A, B, A, B in a poem actually means, it would be getting more into literary analysis, like why they use that.
Exactly. And even more specifically, like how it generates meaning, how it creates in us as readers or as listeners. Right. It's that's a great analogy. That's perfect. It's not analysis. Now, the problem is most of the undergrad core is learning those things, because you can't do theory unless you know the tools with which you do theory, right? And it takes time to fluency with those tools and to learn to recognize them quickly enough for it to actually be useful as a listener, as a performer, as an educator. And it's a really difficult sort of balance to walk as a theory teacher, to like help your students learn what these tools are and how to use them and actually doing theory. It's a really difficult line to walk.
I think that's really good to hear, because I'm not going to be taking any music theory classes, but I think, like what you said, some people are going to be coming to your educational facility and they'll be learning from you or from others. There's a lot of people studying this field. There's a lot of people that this does impact, and understanding the value in it is really important. And then also from your perspective as a teacher, like some of the fears that, hey, these people might not be taking this the right way, and not that you can prevent somebody's going to walk out of your classroom and just not be interested in how it is, or it doesn't relate to them directly, or however they might feel about it, but just realizing on the whole that you're trying to add value and make them a better person and try to give them some tools going forward, whatever their field might be in relation to music. Well, thanks for joining me, David. It was really fun. I feel like I'm a better person, and I don't have all the tools of music theory, but I feel like at least to some degree I understand what you're trying to do and why it has meaning, and I'd probably look into it a little bit more, maybe even ask you some follow-up questions another time. And I'm sure if Nathan listens to this, and any of your music friends, feel free to share it with them. If they have comments, they can comment on YouTube, or they can join me in a podcast and debate you about why music theory.
Nathan and I can fight about it later.
Okay, sounds good. Start a Twitter war or email campaign, whatever you're going to do.
No, really, thanks for having me on.
Hey, well, thanks for joining me on the Chattervast podcast, and I'll see you guys all next time. Remember, like, comment, subscribe. It helps the YouTube algorithm, and if you're on podcast, give a review. I appreciate it. Share it with your friends, your family, and we'll all learn to be better people and understand and add a little bit of critical thinking to what you already observe and appreciate better. See you guys next time.